The chamber was silent as they brought Daniel Brooks to the center platform, his hands bound with glowing energy restraints that hummed softly in the massive circular room, where representatives from 47 alien species watched from their tiered seats, their various forms creating a strange display of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations as High Arbiter Velthros, a towering crystalline being, raised one of his 3 arms and spoke with cold authority that echoed through the chamber about how Ambassador Brooks of Humanity had been found guilty of espionage and sedition and violations of Council Protocol 7, and the sentence was death to be carried out immediately, while Daniel looked up at the assembled representatives with his jaw set firm despite the fear coursing through his body because he had done nothing wrong except discover the truth about the Council's trade restrictions on humanity, restrictions designed to keep Earth and its colonies dependent on alien technology and resources. So he spoke calmly and said this was murder, and his government would not stand for it and humanity would not forget. But Velthros tilted his massive head as light refracted through his crystalline features and said, humanity was a young species that would learn their place or be taught it. And then the execution was swift as an energy beam lanced down from the ceiling, and Daniel Brooks ceased to exist with his body converted to scattered atoms in less than a second. The Y message was transmitted to Earth within the hour along with the Council's official statement, declaring humanity's ambassador a criminal, but what the Council failed to understand was the nature of the species they had just provoked. Because humanity had been peaceful for nearly 2 centuries ever since making first contact, following the rules and paying the unfair tariffs and accepting their position as newcomers to galactic society, yet there were lines that should never be crossed, and the Council had just crossed one written in ancient human blood. So Admiral Ryan Cole received the transmission aboard the EDF Valiant, humanity's largest dreadnought stationed in the Sol system, and he watched the footage 3 times with his weathered face growing harder with each viewing. While around him on the bridge his crew stood in stunned silence until he said to get him, President Hayes, and to send word to Fleet Command that he wanted every ship they had ready to move within 24 hours. And Lieutenant Karen Price, his communications officer, turned from her station to say that the Council had 30,000 vessels while humanity had maybe 300 that could match their capital ships. But Ryan's eyes never left the screen where Daniel Brooks had stood moments before his death, as he said then, they would make every one of them count, and to send the message. Back on Earth in the Global Defense Council headquarters in Geneva, President Linda Hayes sat in emergency session with military commanders and civilian leadership from every major nation, where the room was tense and filled with angry voices calling for immediate action as General Marcus Flynn, commander of Earth's ground forces, slammed his fist on the table and said they murdered their ambassador in cold blood and this was an act of war, while Secretary Chen Wei, the diplomatic advisor, countered that it was also a death sentence if they retaliated because the Council had been around for 10,000 years and had resources humanity could not even imagine. But President Hayes raised her hand, and the room fell silent because she was a relatively young leader at 52. But her eyes held a steel that commanded respect. So she said Secretary Wei was right about their resources, but Daniel Brooks was under their protection, representing their species under diplomatic immunity, and if they let this stand they were telling the galaxy that human lives were worthless. Then she stood and placed her palms flat on the table to say that General Flynn should begin mobilization of all military assets with Admiral Cole having command of the fleet because they were not starting a war. They could not win, but they were going to make sure the Council understood who they had challenged. In the Proxima Centauri colony, the largest human settlement outside the Sol system, Governor Paul Bennett watched the news feeds with growing dread because his colony was home to 20 million people, most of them civilians, and they were the closest human population to Council space, which made them the most vulnerable. So his assistant Nicole Grant entered his office with a data pad to say they were getting reports of Council ships moving toward the border zones with at least 5 battle groups, and Paul nodded slowly to say they were testing humanity to see if they would back down. Then he pulled up a communication line to the Colonial Defense Force to tell Commander Peters that he needed to evacuate all non-essential personnel from the outer stations, because if the Council wanted a war, they were going to come through there first. The pieces were moving into position as humanity had been given a bloody lesson about galactic politics, and now they would teach one of their own because Across human space, the response was unified and swift, with every nation on Earth contributing ships and crews and resources to the war effort that was about to begin, while factories that had produced civilian goods for decades were being retooled for military production, and recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers who wanted to serve and avenge Ambassador Brooks. And the human species that had been peaceful for generations was remembering how to fight because they understood that sometimes peace could only be maintained through strength and the willingness to use it. Admiral Ryan Cole stood alone in his ready room, aboard the Valiant, and looked at the picture of Daniel Brooks on his display, a young man who had been dedicated to building bridges between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, a diplomat who believed in peaceful cooperation and mutual understanding. And now that young man was dead, murdered for telling the truth about corruption and exploitation. So Ryan made a silent promise to the image on the screen that Daniel's death would not be in vain, and that humanity would make the council answer for what they had done. Then he straightened his uniform and walked back onto the bridge where his crew was, preparing the ship for war, because the time for words had passed and now was the time for action. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity was not like other species, because when humans were pushed, they did not surrender, and they did not submit. Instead, they pushed back with everything they had, and the council had just pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed before. So now the response would come, and it would be swift, and it would be terrible, and it would teach the galaxy a lesson about respecting human life and human dignity, because Ambassador Daniel Brooks deserved justice, and humanity would deliver it no matter the cost or the consequences. And the ships were gathering, and the crews were preparing, and soon the fleets would move, and the war would begin. The human fleet began assembling at Staging Point Achilles, a military station positioned just outside the Oort cloud. And for 72 hours, warships dropped out of faster than light, travel in ones and twos until 314 vessels hung in formation against the backdrop of distant stars, while Admiral Ryan Cole stood on the bridge of the EDF Valiant watching the tactical display as more ships joined the formation, because they were outgunned and outnumbered, but they had something the council did not expect, which was purpose born from righteous anger that would drive them forward no matter the odds they faced. Commander Lisa Hayes, his executive officer, reported that the final count was in with 47 dreadnoughts and 92 heavy cruisers and 120 destroyers and 55 support vessels, for a total crew complement of just over 200,000 people who were ready to fight and die for their species. And Ryan nodded as his eyes scanned the names of the ships on his display, because each one represented thousands of lives and families back home, and dreams of a peaceful future that had just been shattered. So he asked about the council's response, and Lisa said their border fleets were mobilizing with intelligence estimates showing a force 3 times their size at minimum, and they were treating this as a minor rebellion, which made Ryan smile thinly, because he said that was good, and they should let the council underestimate them. On Earth, the war effort had transformed the planet overnight, as factories that once produced civilian goods were retooled for military production, and recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers, and the human species that had been peaceful for generations remembered how to fight, while Dr. Helen Martinez stood in her laboratory at the Advanced Weapons Research Facility in Colorado, where holographic displays showed schematics for humanity's newest advantage, which were quantum disruption torpedoes that would give them an edge against superior numbers. So Colonel Stephen Parker, the military liaison to her research team, asked how many they could produce in the next week, and Helen ran calculations on her display to say if they pushed every fabrication facility to maximum capacity, maybe 500 units that were unstable with varying yields, but in fleet engagement scenarios they would cut through council shields like they were not even there. And Stephen told her to get it done because the Admiral shipped out in 6 days. At the Galactic Council headquarters on Vex Prime, the mood was far different, as most council members viewed humanity's military build-up with contempt rather than concern, because they had crushed rebellions before and they would crush this one. But not everyone was so confident as Ambassador Krelix of the Vrin Collective, a species that had fought a brief war with humanity 50 years ago over mining rights, stood before the council with his wings partially extended in agitation to say they were making a grave mistake, because he had studied humanity extensively and they were not like other species. And when cornered, they did not submit but fought with a ferocity that defied logic. But High Arbiter Velthros waved one crystalline hand dismissively, to say they were primitives with barely 3 centuries of space travel and their fleet would be swept aside, and then the Council would occupy their systems until they learned proper respect. So Krellis replied that was what his people had thought, and they lost 40 ships to human experimental weapons before they agreed to arbitration because humans fought without honor and without rules and they cheated. But Velthro said then the Council would teach them the consequences of their defiance. Back at Staging Point Achilles, Admiral Ryan Cole called his command staff together for final briefing, where the holographic display showed their target, which was the Draken system that housed a major Council naval base and supply depot. And he explained this was going to be a shock and awe operation because the Council expected them to either negotiate or defend their borders, but they were going to do neither. Instead, they would punch the Council right in the mouth where it hurt. So Captain Edward Morris of the heavy cruiser Interceptor leaned forward to say the Drakon system had orbital defense platforms and mines, and at least 30 capital ships stationed there without counting whatever reinforcements they could call in. But Ryan said he was counting on those defenses because they were not going to win a long war of attrition. So they needed to make the Council bleed and make them hurt and make them question whether humanity was worth the cost. Lieutenant Karen Price brought up additional intelligence about a Council diplomatic convoy that would be passing through the Theta corridor in 4 days carrying representatives from 15 species including 2 Council seats, and Ryan studied the route carefully before saying they would split their forces with Battlegroup Delta hitting Draken while he took a strike force to intercept that convoy because they were going to send a message that if the Council wanted to execute human ambassadors, then humanity could reach theirs too. So the orders went out and the fleet began preparations. As crews drilled on damage control, procedures and pilots ran simulations on the new fighter craft equipped with the quantum torpedoes, and every ship was loaded with supplies for a campaign that might last months or years. On the colony ship New Horizon, positioned with the civilian evacuation fleet, journalist Claire Watson recorded her observations as she spoke into her recorder about how today she watched humanity prepare for war. Not a war of conquest or resources, but a war of principle, because Ambassador Brooks died because he told the truth, and now 250,000 of their people were preparing to make the galaxy understand that human lives mattered and that their dignity was not negotiable. Then she paused to watch through the viewport as the massive dreadnought Valiant moved past, with its hull painted with the flags of every nation on Earth, and she said she did not know if they could win, but she knew they were going to try, and maybe that was what it meant to be human. Admiral Ryan Cole made one final call before the fleet departed as the secure channel connected him to President Hayes in Geneva, and he said simply that they were ready while Linda Hayes looked tired with the weight of her decision evident in her eyes as she told him to bring them home, all of them if he could. So Ryan said he would do his best, but she should know that once they started this there was no going back because the Council would never forget. And she replied that neither would humanity as the channel closed, leaving Ryan to turn to his crew and feel the weight of history on his shoulders because in the next few days humanity would either establish itself as a force to be respected in the galaxy, or they would be crushed as a cautionary tale for other species, and either way Ambassador Daniel Brooks would be avenged. He broadcast across the fleet to all ships that this was Admiral Cole telling them to execute jump sequence with target being the Draken system, and he said to show them what happens when you mess with Earth. So 314 ships vanished in flashes of bent spacetime, leaving empty void where humanity's vengeance had gathered, and the war that would reshape the galaxy had finally begun with humanity, striking first and striking hard to prove they would not be victims or slaves, but equals who demanded respect. The Drakon system erupted in chaos as humanity's battle group dropped out of faster-than-light travel within the inner orbital zone where warning klaxons blared across every Council vessel and station as sensors detected the impossible, which was an enemy fleet that had appeared practically on top of them. And Commander Lisa Hayes stood at her tactical station aboard the Valiant with her fingers flying across the holographic controls to confirm enemy contacts of 32 capital ships and 57 escorts and 8 orbital defense platforms that were scrambling to battle stations. Admiral Ryan Cole's strike force had split off for the convoy intercept, leaving Vice Admiral Gregory Kane in command of the main assault, and Gregory was a veteran of the Vryn conflict who watched the tactical display with cold calculation, because they had perhaps 5 minutes before the Council fleet could organize an effective defense. So he ordered all ships to open fire with weapons free and target priority, being defense platforms first, then their command carriers, and he told them to launch the quantum torpedoes that Dr. Helen Martinez had designed. The human fleet opened fire with everything they had as conventional railguns sent streams of projectiles at relativistic speeds while energy weapons carved through the void. But the real surprise came from the experimental weapons that looked like normal missiles to Council sensors until they hit their targets. And instead of exploding, they created localized quantum field collapses that tore apart matter at the subatomic level. So the first orbital platform simply ceased to exist, with its atoms scattering across millions of kilometers, while Lieutenant James Crawford from Weapons Control reported direct hit on Platform 3 and Platform 5 breaking apart and Platform 7 gone. But the Council forces were recovering from their shock as the massive Cathari, Dreadnought Infinite Glory, rotated its bulk to bring its main weapons to bear, and energy beams capable of vaporizing a small moon lanced out to catch the human destroyer. Vigilant amidships, so the ship broke in two with its reactor core, detonating in a brief star. And Lisa said with a tight voice that Vigilant was down with all hands lost, but Gregory commanded them to keep pressing as all destroyers should execute attack pattern Delta and get in close where the big Council guns could not track them. The smaller human ships dove into the Council formation, like wolves among sheep as their point defense systems shredded Council fighters while their torpedoes targeted weapon systems and engines. And it was brutal close-quarters combat that the Council had not experienced in centuries. So across the system, Captain Jennifer Cole commanded the heavy cruiser, defiant in a deadly dance with 3 Council escort vessels where her ship was faster and more maneuverable. But the enemy had superior shields and firepower, and she ordered them to bring the ship about and target the middle ship's shield generators and fire when ready. So Defiant's railguns spoke and sent tungsten penetrators at a fraction of light speed, while the Council vessel's shields flickered and failed, and the next salvo tore through its hull with atmosphere venting into space along with bodies and debris. Lieutenant Commander Victor Ross from Tactical said one was down, but they had 2 more on their tail and their rear shields were at 40%. So Jennifer watched her displays and calculated angles and timing before ordering Helm to execute full emergency stop on her mark, and she counted down 3, 2, 1 mark, which made the Defiant's engines reverse at full power, with her momentum arrested in seconds while the 2 pursuing Council ships shot past and suddenly found themselves in front of their prey instead of behind, allowing Defiant's forward weapons to carve into their engines and cripple both vessels. Meanwhile, Admiral Ryan, Cole's smaller strike force, emerged from FTL in the Theta Corridor directly in the path of the Council diplomatic convoy, where his force of 30 ships was tiny compared to the main battle group, but their target was even more lightly defended. And Karen Price reported convoy confirmed with 15 diplomatic vessels and 10 escort ships that were broadcasting on all frequencies demanding they stand down. But Ryan's jaw was set in a hard line as he told them to ignore their transmissions and target the escort ships because he wanted those diplomats alive to deliver his message. Tikai, human strike force, fell upon the convoy like avenging angels as the escort ships, designed more for ceremony than combat, were overwhelmed in minutes, and Ryan had ordered his crews to disable rather than destroy them, so precision fire knocked out engines and weapons without causing critical casualties, while the diplomatic ships themselves tried to scatter, but human destroyers corralled them like sheepdogs with a flock, and within 20 minutes all 15 vessels were secured under human control. Ryan ordered them to open a channel to the lead diplomatic ship, where Ambassador Threxel of the Moradin Union appeared on the display with his amphibious alien skin paled to a sickly gray and his gills fluttering with agitation as he said, "This was an outrageous violation of diplomatic protocols and they could not do this." But Ryan interrupted to say they could not, and asked if the Council did not execute their ambassador 3 days ago. So he told Threxel not to lecture them about protocols, while the alien tried to say that Ambassador Brooks was a criminal. But Ryan said coldly that Brooks discovered evidence of their trade conspiracy against humanity, because they had all his data transmitted before his murder, and every unfair tariff and every restricted technology, and every backroom deal to keep humanity dependent on council resources, was known to them. Now Threxel's gills stopped moving entirely as behind him other diplomats whispered frantically, and Ryan continued to say that they were all going to return to the council and deliver a message that humanity did not start this war, but they were going to fight it with everything they had, and every council ship destroyed and every base captured and every life lost was on their heads. So if they wanted peace, then they were going to give Ambassador Brooks the justice he deserved and end their exploitation of humanity. But Threxel said, trying to recover his composure, that the council would never negotiate with terrorists. And Ryan replied flatly that then humanity would keep killing them until they did. And he told the diplomat he was free to go into carry their message before cutting the transmission and turning to his crew to order the release of the diplomatic ships while keeping their escorts disabled. Back in the Draken system, the battle was reaching its climax as the humans had destroyed or disabled half the council fleet, but they were taking heavy losses themselves, with 23 human ships destroyed outright and most of the survivors bearing significant damage, and the Cathari dreadnought Infinite Glory remained the linchpin of the council defense because its massive shields had absorbed countless hits and its weapons had claimed 6 human vessels. So Vice Admiral Gregory Kane made a decision to order all remaining ships with quantum torpedoes to target the Infinite Glory with full salvo, and all tubes and everything they had. Lisa Hayes looked at him sharply to say that would deplete their entire stock and if they needed them later, but Gregory said they would not need them if they did not survive here, and to execute the order. So 37 quantum disruption torpedoes streaked across the void, with each one being a small package of reality warping death, and the Infinite Glory's defenses managed to intercept 12 of them, but the remaining 25 hit home to make the massive dreadnought shudder as quantum fields collapsed throughout its structure and its shields failed. Then its armor began to disintegrate, and the ship's captain had only seconds to realize his defeat before his ship tore itself apart from within. The destruction of their flagship broke the council fleet's morale as the surviving ships began to retreat and jump to FTL in 1s and 2s, and the humans let them go because they were too exhausted and damaged to pursue. So Gregory ordered ceasefire and asked for damage reports from all ships while the cost became clear over the next hour, showing that humanity had lost 31 ships and over 40,000 crew members, but they had destroyed or captured 42 council vessels and eliminated all 8 orbital defense platforms and captured the Dracon supply depot intact. And more importantly, they had proven that humanity could fight and win against overwhelming odds, which would change everything in the war that was just beginning. The news of humanity's twin victories spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and within days every species in council space knew that the upstart humans had struck a devastating blow against the establishment. So the reaction was mixed, as some species were horrified while others were secretly pleased to see the council bloodied, and a few began quietly reassessing their own positions regarding the conflict that was reshaping galactic politics. At the council headquarters on Vex Prime, emergency sessions had been running continuously for 48 hours as High Arbiter Velthros stood before the assembled representatives, with his crystalline form pulsing with barely controlled rage, to declare that this aggression could not stand, and they had mobilized 5 battle fleets totaling over 1,500 vessels that would crush humanity's military and occupy their colonies and make an example that would echo for millennia. But Ambassador Krelix of the Vryn Collective was not so certain, as he said they lost nearly 100 ships in 2 engagements, and the humans had weapons they did not understand and tactics that defied conventional warfare. So perhaps they should consider negotiation, but Velthros turned his attention to the Vryn ambassador to say negotiation was impossible, because the humans attacked diplomatic vessels and seized council territory, and there would be no negotiation until they were on their knees. In a corner of the chamber, Ambassador Lyra Quinn of the Solarian Protectorate watched the proceedings with her species' characteristic 4 eyes, as the Solarians had maintained neutrality in most council conflicts, preferring trade to war, but she had studied humanity extensively, and what she saw worried her. So after the session, she sent a private message to her government to recommend immediate withdrawal of all Solarian assets from conflict zones, because humanity was not fighting to win but fighting to survive, and there was a difference that made them far more dangerous than the council understood. On Earth, President Linda Hayes addressed a joint session of the Global Congress as her Speech was broadcast to every human colony and ship in space, and she began by saying that 3 weeks ago Ambassador Daniel Brooks was murdered by the Galactic Council, executed without fair trial and without proper evidence, and without basic respect for human dignity. And the Council believed they could kill one of theirs without consequence, but they were wrong. So she paused to let her words sink in before continuing that their military forces had struck back, not in blind revenge but in righteous defense of their sovereignty, and they had shown the galaxy that humanity would not be bullied and would not be exploited and would not let the murder of their people go unanswered. She said clearly that they did not seek endless war but sought justice and respect in a galaxy where all species, whether they had been traveling the stars for 10,000 years or 300, were treated as equals. And to the Council she said to end their unjust trade restrictions and acknowledge their wrongdoing in Ambassador Brooks's execution and treat humanity as partners, not as subjects. Because if they did this, then humanity would gladly negotiate peace. But if they refused, then humanity would continue to fight for every human life and every human colony and every human right with everything they had. The speech resonated across human space and beyond as more volunteers flooded recruitment centers and industrial output reached wartime levels not seen since the ancient world wars. So humanity was fully committed to the conflict now, while at the Proxima Centauri colony, Governor Paul Bennett coordinated with Commander Arthur Peters of the Colonial Defense Force as intelligence. Reports showed a massive council fleet heading their way, and Arthur said they were sending everything they had with 5 battle fleets and probably 3,000 ships total that would arrive in 6 days. So Paul looked at the numbers and felt his stomach sink, because they had maybe 50 defense ships and orbital platforms, and the council would go through them like wet paper. But Arthur said not if they evacuated the main population, first because they had transport ships ready, and could get 90% of the civilians out in 4 days if they started now. Paul asked about the colony itself, and Arthur said grimly that they would make the council pay for every inch and buy time for the civilians to escape and for Admiral Cole to bring the fleet. So they were not going to win this fight, but they could make it hurt. And Paul nodded slowly to say do it and begin evacuation immediately, while telling Arthur to give them hell. The exodus from Proxima Centauri began within hours as millions of colonists abandoned their homes and took only what they could carry. And transport ships lifted off around the clock, carrying humanity's most vulnerable away from the coming storm. But not everyone left as 15,000 volunteers. Many of them veterans or young people who had never seen combat, stayed behind to defend the colony and fortified positions and laid mines and prepared for a siege they knew they could not survive. And among them was Private Nathan Wells, a 19-year-old who had been studying engineering before the war. And as he helped position automated defense turrets, his hands shook slightly until Sergeant Caroline Mitchell, a grizzled veteran who had fought in border skirmishes before, asked if it was his first time. So Nathan said it was that obvious, and Caroline said with a slight smile that he was still breathing, which meant he was smarter than the dead ones, and more honest than the ones pretending they were not scared, and she told him he would do fine. Meanwhile, Admiral Ryan Cole had regrouped his forces and was racing back toward human space as his fleet had grown to 400 ships with reserves and newly commissioned vessels joining his command. But he knew it would not be enough against 3,000 Council warships. So he told his command staff they could not meet them head-on, because the Council had 10 times their numbers, and they needed to be smart about this. And Commander Lisa Hayes brought up star charts showing the route from Council space to Proxima Centauri, where they had to pass through the Orion Nebula to reach the colony, and the nebula's dust clouds would interfere with their sensors and communications. Captain Edward Morris pointed out that it would interfere with human sensors too. But Ryan said studying the charts that they knew how to fight blind, because they had been the underdogs from the start, while the Council was used to overwhelming firepower and perfect coordination. So he began plotting waypoints through the nebula to say they would split into small hunter-killer groups and use the dust clouds for cover, and hit the Council from unexpected angles to make them paranoid and make them slow down to maintain formation security and buy time for the evacuation. But Lieutenant Karen Price looked concerned to say that fighting in the nebula meant they would take heavy casualties, because ships would get separated and communications would be spotty, and it would be chaos. And Ryan agreed, but said it would be chaos they were prepared for while the Council was not. As the human fleet prepared for their desperate gambit, Dr. Helen Martinez worked around the clock on Earth to produce new weapons as her team had developed something even more devastating than the quantum torpedoes, which were singularity mines that could create temporary micro-black holes. And she explained to Colonel Stephen Parker that they were horrifically unstable, with the containment field only lasting about 30 seconds after activation. But if they could get them deployed in the enemy's path, each mine would swallow everything within 1,000 kilometers, so Stephen asked how many she could make. And Helen said they had 50 ready now and maybe another 100 in the next week, if they pushed every facility to the breaking point. And Stephen told her to do it, because the Admiral needed every advantage they could give him. Back at Proxima Centauri, the First Council, scouts began probing the system as Commander Arthur Peters watched the sensor readings with growing tension, and his tactical officer reported 4 light scouts that were mapping their defenses. So Arthur said to let them because they wanted the Council to see their positions, and when the main fleet arrived, they needed them to commit to a direct assault, because if the Council decided to just bombard them from range, this whole plan would fall apart. And Governor Paul Bennett, who had refused to evacuate with the civilians, stood beside him to ask if Arthur thought they would take the bait. And Arthur said they were angry and overconfident, so they would come in close to make a statement, and when they did, humanity would make them regret it as the pieces moved toward a confrontation that would determine everything. The Council Armada emerged from FTL at the edge of the Orion Nebula as a massive formation of 3,000 warships, representing the pinnacle of galactic military might, and High Commander Zarthul of the Cathari. Imperium stood on the bridge of the Super Dreadnought, Eternal Dominion surveying his fleet with satisfaction, while his tactical officer reported that all battle fleets had arrived successfully, with forward scouts reporting no enemy contacts, and the nebula ahead showing standard interference patterns. So Zarthul asked about the human colony at Proxima Centauri, and was told it was defended by approximately 50 vessels and orbital fortifications with civilians evacuating, and the estimate was 3 days until they reached engagement range, which made Zarthul's crystalline features shift in what passed for a smile among his species, as he said they ran like prey, and the Council would make an example of their colony that would echo across the galaxy. Then he ordered all ships to maintain formation and proceed through the nebula. What the Council commander did not know was that humanity's fleet was already inside the nebula, scattered across millions of cubic kilometers in small hunter-killer groups, and Admiral Ryan Cole watched his tactical display aboard the Valiant, where each friendly marker represented a group of 5 to 10 ships, positioned throughout the dust clouds. So Commander Lisa Hayes reported that the enemy fleet was entering the nebula and maintaining tight formation exactly as predicted, which made Ryan say perfect, because they were thinking like they were on parade, and he sent the signal for all groups to execute, hammer and anvil, throughout. The nebula human ships powered up their drives and moved to attack positions as the dust clouds that interfered with sensors would mask their approach, until they were practically on top of their targets. So Strike Group Falcon, led by Captain Jennifer Cole aboard the Defiant, crept through the cosmic dust toward the Council fleet's left flank, and her group of 7 ships moved in complete electronic silence while relying on passive sensors and pre-plotted coordinates, and Lieutenant Commander Victor Ross whispered that target acquisition was in 3 minutes. But Jennifer ordered weapons hot, though they should hold fire until all groups were in position, because they would get one chance at surprise. Across the nebula, dozens of similar groups moved into attack positions as the Council fleet, confident in their numbers and power, never saw them coming. And Lisa Hayes said quietly that all groups reported ready, and they had firing solutions on the Council capital ships. So Ryan Cole took a breath, because 40,000 of his people were about to attack an enemy fleet 7 times their size in conditions that made coordinated defense nearly impossible. And it was madness, and it was desperation, and it was humanity's only chance. So he broadcast on the encrypted channel to all ships to fire at will. The nebula erupted in chaos as human ships materialized from the dust clouds on all sides of the Council formation, with their weapons already firing, and quantum torpedoes streaked toward capital ships while railguns and energy weapons tore into escorts. So the element of surprise was total and devastating as the Council Super Dreadnought Celestial Might exploded when 3 quantum torpedoes hit its reactor core simultaneously, while the heavy carrier Stormbringer broke in half as a human destroyer. Group focused all their fire on its center section, and 8 Council ships died in the first 30. seconds before they even knew they were under attack. Lisa Hayes reported, with fierce satisfaction, that the enemy fleet was breaking formation and trying to establish defensive perimeters, but the dust was interfering with their coordination. Yet the Council forces were far from defeated, because as the initial shock wore off, their numerical advantage began to tell, and human ships that stayed too long in one position found themselves bracketed by enemy fire as the destroyer Hammer took a direct hit from a Cathari dreadnought's main weapon and simply vaporized Captain Jennifer. Cole's strike group Falcon had crippled 2 Council cruisers when suddenly 8 enemy destroyers emerged from the dust on an intercept course. So she commanded evasive maneuvers and told all ships to scatter pattern Delta and regroup at waypoint 7, and the human ships broke in different directions as their smaller size and greater maneuverability gave them an edge in the dust-obscured battlefield. But not all of them made it because the frigate Courageous was too slow to evade, and enemy fire cut it down. So Victor reported grimly that Courageous was gone, but the rest of the group was clear and regrouping. The battle in the nebula raged for 6 hours as a brutal game of hide-and-seek, among dust clouds and stars where human ships would strike from the dust and claim their victims and disappear before the Council could bring overwhelming force to bear, and it was costing the Council dearly, but humanity was bleeding too. So Admiral Ryan Cole watched the casualty reports mount and asked how many they had lost, and Lisa reported 73 ships destroyed and another 45 heavily damaged. But the Council had lost over 200, including 12 capital ships, so they were killing them at a 3-to-1 ratio. But Ryan said not good enough because the Council could afford those losses while humanity could not, and he ordered all groups to begin Phase 2 and fall back toward Proxima Centauri, while making the Council chase them through the narrowest part of the nebula. As the human fleet executed a fighting retreat, Dr. Helen Martinez's singularity mines were being deployed along their withdrawal route, and the mines floated dormant in the dust, waiting for the Council fleet to stumble into them, while the Cathari High Commander Zarthul was furious because his mighty armada had been bloodied by guerrilla tactics and was now being lured deeper into this accursed nebula, so his officers urged caution, but pride and anger drove him forward as he declared they were retreating, and the Council would press the attack. Then he ordered all ships to pursue and destroy the Council fleet charged through the nebula after the withdrawing human forces, and then they hit the minefield. As the first singularity mine activated, when a Council battlecruiser passed within range, and a micro-black hole formed that lasted only seconds but generated gravitational forces that tore the ship apart and pulled in 3 nearby escorts, and the mines had been spaced to create a cascading effect. So over the next 10 minutes, 40 Council ships were destroyed or crippled by the artificial singularities, while Zarthul demanded to know what weapon this was, and his science officer reported unknown technology that was creating temporary spatial distortions where shields were ineffective. But Zarthul ordered them to maintain pursuit because they would endure whatever tricks the humans had, and their colony lay ahead, the running battle, and the minefield had taken their toll as by the time the Council fleet emerged from the nebula they had lost nearly 400 ships, which was more than 10% of their total force, while the human fleet had been reduced to barely 200 operational vessels, and both forces limped toward Proxima Centauri where Commander Arthur Peters and his defenders waited. So his tactical officer reported enemy fleet detected with an estimate of 2,600 ships, but most showing battle damage while the human fleet was with them. And Governor Paul Bennett felt a grim satisfaction, because the civilians had escaped and now the final act would play out. So he told all defensive positions to prepare to engage. The Battle of Proxima Centauri began as the 2 fleets collided in orbit above the colony, and the human defenders threw everything they had at the Council forces, as their orbital platforms and surface-based weapons added to the chaos. So the Council's overwhelming numbers allowed them to push through, but every meter cost them ships and lives, while Admiral Ryan Cole brought the Valiant alongside the Eternal Dominion in a fight between 2 super dreadnoughts. And while the Council ship was larger and more powerful, the Valiant had desperation on its side, so Ryan ordered all weapons to target their command section, because if they could kill the flagship, maybe the rest would break. The 2 massive ships exchanged fire at point-blank range as their shields flared and failed under the onslaught, and Ryan's bridge shook with each hit while consoles exploded and crew members scrambled to maintain control. So Lisa Hayes reported that forward shields were down with hull breaches on decks 4 through 7, and they could not take much more of this. But Ryan said neither could the Council and told them to load their last quantum torpedo and target the enemy bridge. And the final torpedo streaked across the void to punch through the Eternal Dominion's failing shields and detonate inside the ship's command section where High Commander Zarthul had one moment to realize his mistake before quantum dissolution claimed him. The Council flagship broke apart with massive pieces, tumbling through space, and suddenly the remaining Council forces hesitated as Lisa reported the enemy fleet was receiving new orders and they were withdrawing. So Ryan could not believe it and told her to confirm. And she said confirmed as the Council fleet was breaking off and jumping to FTL because they were retreating. And the human forces, exhausted and battered, watched in stunned silence as the Council armada fled because they had won. At a terrible cost against impossible odds, humanity had won. But Ryan Cole felt no triumph as he surveyed the damage because the Proxima Centauri colony was a burning wreck, and nearly 200